Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our webinar, God's Earth, Not Ours to Own, Undoing Possession Through Christian Hope. We just started the live stream, so as usual, we'll give it about a minute to make sure folks can get on, and then we'll introduce our absolutely phenomenal speakers and dive into our content. Very grateful to be with you. If you'd like, you can use the chat feature to introduce yourself. Let us know where in the world you're joining us from today. We're really, really grateful to have you and looking forward to this conversation. All right, well, in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you again for joining us for this really critical conversation with three absolutely brilliant speakers that I'm so excited to hear from today. My name is Destiny Magnet. I serve as the Programs and Outreach Manager here at Churches for Middle East Peace. Churches for Middle East Peace, if you're new to our work, is an ecumenical Christian organization dedicated to promoting policies for holistic, sustainable, and just peace for all people in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Palestine and Israel. This conversation today, I think, is going to be really generative along these lines as we think about what it means to continue to hope, what decolonial theologies of land might look like, and how we can understand possession and land significance, sacredness in new lights, and particularly through the lens of what we're seeing unfold in Gaza and broader Palestine today. I want to give the bulk of our time to our three outstanding panelists, and so we'll hear opening remarks from each of them. I'll introduce each of them in turn, but I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Ben Norquist, Dr. Willie James Jennings, and Mark Charles with us today. All three of them are brilliant minds, theologians, and faithful witnesses for justice in our world today. And so with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Ben Norquist, who is a researcher and organizer, as well as my colleague at Churches for Middle East Peace, where he directs our grants programs. He has also led over the past several months the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. His first book, Every Somewhere Sacred, Rescuing a Theology of Place in the American Imagination from InterVarsity Press, is due out later this year. Ben is a fantastic colleague, has had a great career in higher education leadership, international partnerships, teaching, and his writing has appeared in a number of outlets. And so the question that we're going to ask our panelists to kind of engage with in these opening remarks is a big one, and I'll state it here and then hand the virtual microphone over to Ben. But it's how should Christians globally, and especially in the West, think about land, theology, and justice when engaging ongoing crises in the Middle East, including in Palestine? They might engage with narratives of chosenness, covenant, and territory, and the colonial patterns that emerge from them. And so with that in mind, Dr. Norquist, over to you.
Thanks, Destiny. Much appreciated. It's a joy to be Destiny's colleague. And I have to say on this occasion how honored I am to be a part of a panel with Willie Jennings and Mark Charles, both of whom are giants in my mind and my thinking and research. The book that Destiny mentioned actually relies a good bit on both of their thoughts and quotes from both of their writings. As we seek to think about land in fresh ways, in liberatory ways. And I also want to express thanks to Brian Miller, who's my co-author for the book. Dr. Brian Miller is a sociologist of the highest order at Wheaton College. And we've been working on this book for a little while now. There is no publication date quite set because we're just finishing our revisions, and so it's in this form right now. So, but it's going back to the publisher actually within the week, and then I'm hoping that we'll have a path forward, a specific path forward for that book. I start with a story. It's a personal story about doing research for my dissertation, which was about higher education in Palestine, in Bethlehem in particular. And so I was having conversations with Palestinian educators and learners about their work and their lives and their institutions and the kinds of accommodations that they have to make in order to pursue those goals under conditions of occupation and, critically, under conditions of settler colonialism. And so my one-term answer to this big question, Destiny, is settler colonialism. It's something that I read a good bit about as I was working on my dissertation. And academically, it was really important for the work. But in my heart, as I was reading about settler colonialism over there, it was growing in my heart that here I was thinking about another context, but doing the work from right here on this ground where I live, a piece of which I own according to U.S. law, is itself a settler colonial context. And if it grew in me that if I wanted to write credibly and with integrity about settler colonialism there, I had to wrestle with it here as well. And I started to do that in a variety of ways, and opening conversations with people who could help, and digging into even hyper locally to the particular history of this plot of land that I benefit from every day, tracing its ownership back to a patent that the United States government issued to Thomas Patchell in 1845, the first time that this parcel of land had been owned in that particular kind of way. But then digging further back into the kinds of maneuvers and actions that the United States government took in order to gain possession of this piece of land so that it could be sold. And that story goes deeper into this particular piece of land and the Potawatomi who were here, and the particular village that was on the DuPage River, just half a mile up from where my house is. It became a deeply personal question as well as academic. But bringing then insight back and forth between settler colonialism in this context that I was studying for my dissertation and the settler colonialism of the place where I live was an important step for me. What is settler colonialism? If colonialism is the domination of a place and a people by another place and people for the sake of extraction of value, of military benefit, of economic benefit, then speaking in the broadest of terms, settler colonialism is the domination of a people by another people for the sake of transfer. Lorenzo Veracini talks about transfer as being the removal of an indigenous population or the sidelining of an indigenous population for the sake of making room for a settler population. And he deepens our understanding of settler colonialism by talking about this domination setting off a competition of sorts to be positioned between these peoples, to be positioned as more truly indigenous, and another competition to be seen as more truly deserving of being at home here. And then he goes on in a chapter called The Tactics of Transfer to drop down into the minutia, the particular maneuvers that a settler colonial enterprise will make in order to win those competitions, to be seen as indigenous and to be seen as more properly deserving of being in this place. Tactics that start out with the use of force and violence, but actually there are only a few in this chapter that catalogs maybe 40 or 50 different tactics of transfer that Veracini is identifying across different contexts of settler colonialism. He starts with necro-military force, but very quickly moves to tactics that are actually the application of structural violence and structural power and of cultural power. And so all of these tactics, the rest of the tactics are administrative in nature, bureaucratic in nature, governmental in nature, legal in nature, and discursive in nature, having to do with the stories that we tell each other. And when it comes to Gaza, these insights are really important because 70% of the residents of Gaza are themselves refugees from a prior application of military force in 1948. They are their homes, the places that they are most locally indigenous to, are now inside of what is Israel. And so for multiple generations, they've been trying to make a home in Gaza. But the policies of the Israeli government towards Gaza are even in moments where direct military violent force is not being applied. These administrative, bureaucratic, and even cultural tactics make it difficult, perhaps impossible, for Gazans to be comfortably, sustainably at home in Gaza. It is an application of settler colonial force and policy towards Gaza. And it's often implicit, but now masks are coming off and it's being made explicit when people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say things like, we are going to cleanse Gaza. We are destroying it. It will be leveled. It will be like a parking lot. Or when our own president decides to describe a future for Gaza that doesn't include Gazans. Those are settler colonialism before our eyes and in our ears.
Thank you so much, Ben, for your opening remarks. I think there's so much that we can build off of in the conversation. And of course, settler colonialism is so key to understanding what's going on and connecting it to our own theologies as Christians and the ways that we've been complicit will be another important part of this conversation. So thank you and looking forward to more. Our next panelist is Dr. Willie James Jennings, who is a theologian teaching in the areas of Christian thought, race theory, decolonial, and environmental studies. He is the author of several books, including The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race from Yale University Press, which was a recipient of the 2010 American Academy of Religion Book of the Year in the Constructive and Reflective Studies category. This book has been called one of the most important theological books written in the last 25 years. In addition, he's also the author of Whiteness and Education in Belonging, which was the inaugural book in the much anticipated series, Theological Education Between the Times. It was also renowned in many ways. We are so lucky to have Dr. Jennings with us today, and I'm so eager to hear your contributions to this vital conversation. So over to you.
Thank you, Destiny. And it's a joy for me to be here with you all and to be with Mark and to hear Ben's wonderful comments and to be present. It's a joyful thing to be in the presence of people who are trying to do the right thing, even if we're talking about people doing the wrong thing. Let me just say a couple of things for my opening comments, and then we can move on to our conversation. We are really in a moment of crisis. especially for those of us who are Christian. It is a crisis at the level of something we probably have not seen for Christianity maybe since the beginning. And the crisis is that there is a reality of the counterfeit that is shaping so much of Christianity. And where it often comes to bear most profoundly is how we understand land and how we understand our life in land. We are inside a profound distortion, and that distortion can really be summarized with one really tragic idea: that we own land. And that reality is so much now a part of the matrix of Christianity for so many people that they don't even know how to think against that way of understanding our life in the world. And where this comes to bear for us at this moment has to do with two things. It has to do with private property, and it has to do with territoriality. So let's take territoriality briefly. We'll come back to this in a moment, but let's take territoriality and understand why this is such a problem. Territoriality means that peoples, nations, have a right to their land. And they may secure that land by any means necessary. That anyone who is on that land, apart from their permission, is an enemy combatant and must be dealt with in whatever is deemed appropriate to protect that land. Now, basically put, that idea of territoriality has been accepted by most people who call themselves Christian. And with that acceptance, it means that we agree to violence, violent takeover, and violent struggle over who may live on that land. And we then theologize inside this fundamental acceptance. Private property, let's take that for just a moment. Private property means that we as an individual, each individual may own, can own something called land and do with it whatever they want. They are Lord and master of their property. And that fundamental idea means that we see the world, we see the earth, we see land, we see animals, we see water as commodity, as thing that we own and may use. And again, this has been woven into so much of Christian life. So what does this mean? It means that right now, the difficulty we're facing in so many parts of the world, especially in the Middle East, especially with the struggle over Palestinian life, is that there is a sick, what I call a spirituality of ownership that shapes so much of the Christian mind and heart. And it's that spirituality of ownership that until we can start to address it, because it is really a spiritual matter at heart. I mean, it's a political, social, economic matter of geopolitics, but it's at heart the spirituality of ownership that we have to challenge, because that spirituality of ownership really is not only heretical, it's demonic. And for so many Christians, they accept that as a way to think about their life in the world, that God has given me something to own called land. And that the idea for me as a Christian, in order to show my discipleship, is to operate in a proper vision of stewardship, how I take care of what is mine and how nations take care of what is theirs. These fundamental ideas have to be challenged. The difficulty is that what I've just said, for many people, and I don't know if it would be many of your listeners, but for many people, what I just said makes no sense. They believe that what I've said is not only wrong, it's backward. Of course we can own. Of course it is ours. Of course God has given it to us. And given that set of commitments, those sets of ideas, It means we have a lot of work ahead of us. All right, let me stop there. Then we can continue on.
Thank you so much. I love this idea of moving from discipleship to stewardship, and I'll have a follow-up question for you when we come around to that. And I'll use this also for our audience. If you have questions for our fantastic panelists, feel free to share those in the chat, and we'll be monitoring them, and we'll have some time for Q&A. But before the conversation, we have one final panelist to add his voice to this discussion, and that's Mark Charles, another incredible, brilliant voice to be a part of this webinar today. So Mark Charles is passionate about creating common memory as he works to build healthier national community, especially across racial lines. He is the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man, and is a graduate of UCLA with a BA in history, today working as an author, speaker, podcaster, activist, preacher, and so much more. He has become one of the leading authorities on the 15th century doctrine of discovery, and in 2019 co-authored the award-winning book, Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Mark also co-founded a national conference for Native students called Would Jesus Eat Fry Bread, and in 2012 hosted in front of the US Capitol a public reading of the National Apology to Native Peoples of the United States that the 112th Congress gave, but buried in the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act. Also, very interestingly, Mark ran as an independent candidate for president of the United States in 2020 with a platform of building a nation where we the people actually means all of the people. He is a dual citizen of the US and the Navajo Nation, and working tirelessly for this good work. Mark is currently writing, and I hope will talk to us a bit about his second book, Decolonizing Faith. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Mark. Open, you're muted.
I apologize for that. So yeah, thank you for that introduction, Destiny, and Dr. Norquist and Dr. Jennings. It's an honor to be on here with both of you. I'm very thrilled to have this conversation we're going to be having. Let me start by just introducing myself traditionally. So Yate, Mark Charles Yinashia, Tsinbake Dene Nishle, Dr. Higlini Bachichin, Tsinbake Dene Dashachedo Toruchitni Dashanala. In our Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're matrilineal as a people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and that's why I say Tsinbake Dene Nishle. Loosely translated, that means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Toa Higlini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake Dene. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Toruchitni, which is the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. I also want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what my people call Washington. It's Washington, D.C. These are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. The Piscataway, they're the nation that they were living here and hunting here, farming here and fishing here, raising their families here and burying their dead here long before Columbus got lost at sea. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be moving, breathing, living on these lands today. The question that you ask, I'm sure all 3 of us could go on for a few hours about this topic and go really into depth in all of this. I'm going to try to give 8 minutes, which is what I was asked to give on this topic. So the one of the short answers is from the book that I co-authored with my good friend Seung-Chan Rah, titled Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. The first sentence of the first chapter of this book says you cannot discover lands that are already inhabited, right? You can conquer those lands, you can steal those lands, you can colonize those lands, but you can't discover them unless your worldview informs you that the people living there are not fully human. So this is one of the challenges we have as a nation, which is this doctrine of discovery. This 14th and 15th century papal bulls coming out of the Catholic Church have become the foundation for sovereignty, land right, and land law here in this country, referenced as recently as 2005. by the Supreme Court. I actually, I gave a link to the hosts of this. They can share that link later, but on the list of links on there, there is a TEDx talk I gave called We the People, the 3 most misunderstood words in US history. And from that link, you can listen to that TED talk, as well as get more information about the book and so on and so forth. But the purpose, the reason Seung-Chan and I wrote Unselling Truths was we wanted to give an open and public rebuke to the US government and the Western Church. European people, white people, are not God's chosen people. The United States, our Turtle Island, North America, is not their promised land. And they do not have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. And so in that book, we critiqued very carefully the history of the church as well as the nation, and very clearly stated that these things are not true, and therefore your justification for them is not valid. I'm not going to go into all of that right now. If you want to get a copy of my book, I'd love to, there's a lot of things in there you can discuss. The point I want to talk about is what I'm calling part 2 of this discussion. I'm writing my second book now called Decolonizing Faith. It's part 2, not in that it's the second part of the story, but in that I'm not covering what's in the first part. I'm assuming people understand that, and I'm building the argument even further. And I'm starting that argument with my grandparents, my father's parents, my nullis. My grandparents were both boarding school survivors. They were taken from their homes. They were put into military-style boarding schools. They were compelled, forced to give up their language, give up their culture, give up their practices, leave their families, and become Americans. They were compelled to accept a faith. They were told that their understanding of the divine and creator and their religious beliefs were not valid. They had to give up their creation story and embrace one of the 2 creation stories found in the book of Genesis. And they were told that what they knew was pagan and wrong, and they had to become this other thing. And my grandparents worked for missionaries most of their lives. They died. Well, they ended their careers working for missionaries. My grandfather was a translator for Christian Reformed missionaries on the Navajo reservation. He helped translate both the hymns and the Bible into Navajo. But because of that, he never had the freedom, the agency to interrogate his faith, to really ask, does this faith acknowledge me as a full human being? And is this the faith I really want to follow? And that's what I've been doing for most of my adult life. Unselling Truths was a part of me interrogating my faith. In this second book, Decolonizing Faith, it's part 2 because when we wrote Unselling Truths, right, we told the United States of America they weren't God's chosen people. We told the church they didn't have a land covenant with the God of Abraham. We critiqued the U.S. military and the doctrines of the church, but people asked me, why are you not critiquing the commands God gives in Deuteronomy where God tells Israel to kill everybody living in Canaan? And I said, well, we're not critiquing scripture. We're just telling Americans and white people who they're not. But the more I thought about it, and after especially I ran for president in 2020, and I really began to think about where our nation's at and where the church is at, I realized, no, we have to answer this question. And so this second book I'm writing to ask the questions that we didn't ask in the first book. And the goal of this second book is literally, my goal is to cause a crisis of faith in the church. That's what I want to do. That's the stated goal. So if anything I say over the next hour causes a crisis in your faith, please buy my book, because that's my goal. I'm trying to disrupt and cause a crisis in your faith. When I go out and speak, many people will say to me, Mark, the church has done horrible things to your people. Why are you a Christian? And I turn the question back on them and say, yeah, your church has done horrible things to people throughout almost its entire history. Why do you keep following this faith? Why are you a Christian? It's not just me who has to go through this crisis. Every believer, when they look at the history of the church, has to go through this crisis of understanding, why do I believe and put my faith in these doctrines and these institutions that have been used as weapons to literally massacre and execute and exterminate millions of people across the globe. And so I think about my grandparents, and one of the most significant spiritual disciplines I've ever had in my life is the discipline of watching the sunrise. I watched the sunrise. I started it back 25 years ago when we moved back to the Navajo Nation. I write about it in the introduction to the book on Selling Truths. When you watch the sunrise on Easter's morning, or when you have an early flight, it's always beautiful. It always catches your breath. But when you watch the sunrise, morning after morning, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and eventually decade after decade, it does something really deep to you. It transforms. I would say, and I did this because my people have been running to the east and watching the sunrise forever. That as long as I know, this is one of our traditions. And I started doing it when I moved back to the Navajo Nation. And it is the most important spiritual discipline I have ever had. I have learned more about Creator and had my relationship with Creator shaped more by the experience of watching the sunrise than it was ever shaped or formed from reading a book. And that makes sense, right? If you want to know Creator, yes, you can pick up a few tidbits from a book, but if you want to know Creator, you have to spend time in creation. And so I imagined how my grandparents would have walked into that boarding school, having been raised and trained to watch the sunrise and understanding things about Creator as young children, now being told they have to embrace this other thing. I want to just walk through this very briefly with you if I can. They write, and the challenge with the Bible is white Christians co-opted the creation story in the Bible, and they took it as their own. But the Jewish people co-opted that creation story from the people of Mesopotamia and took it as their own. White people are probably the furthest demographic we have in this country of people who are the furthest removed from their creation stories. They've long left lands they were indigenous to. And so they cling on to one of the two creation stories in the book of Genesis, the one that has 7 days and 7 mornings and nights. And they say, this is the science textbook of a creation stories. This is how it happened. The purpose of creation stories isn't to tell you how it happened. It's to form your understanding of Creator and your relationship to creation. But they say, no, this is how it happened. And then they find people who believe in other creation stories, because most indigenous peoples have creation stories, and most creation stories include a flood narrative. And they say, your creation story is wrong, the one that you understand from watching the sunrise, and you have to embrace our creation story, which has been nicely recorded in this book. Ignore the second one, because that's not the valid one, but you have to believe this first one. And so I would imagine how my grandparents would have heard that, and what they would have thought of Creator. Right? Creator creates heaven and earth. Man and woman sin. They get punished, but they're not rejected. They're given clothes as they're sent out. Their children disobey. They're also punished, which makes sense. They're held accountable, but the one brother who kills the other is not rejected. He's put a sign on him to go out and protect, or to protect him from death further on. The flood narrative gets really interesting. Because according to Genesis, Creator looks at the world and says, I'm done with it. I'm going to kill everybody. Which doesn't sound like a Creator. Creator decides to spare one family, makes them watch everyone else's death while they're sailing in their little boat. And at the end, Creator gives them a sign. And that sign is actually troubling if you think of it, because the sign doesn't say, I will never destroy the world again. The sign says, I will never destroy the world with a flood again. So if you have a group of children in a room fighting and playing and roughhousing, and when people start getting hurt and damage gets more and more to the room, and a parental figure walks in, grabs a baseball bat, and just beats the tar out of the kids playing in the room. Just beats them, even kills some of them. And when leaving, puts a beautiful picture over the door and says to those who survive the beating, "This is to remind me never to beat you with a bat again." That's not comforting. The problem isn't the bat. The problem is the violent, vindictive, abusive behavior of the parent figure. Later, the creator becomes known as the God of Abraham. The God of Abraham tests Abraham by asking Abraham to kill his son. The God of Abraham also sees the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and says, "That's it, I'm going to kill everybody." Later, the God of Abraham becomes the God of Israel. The God of Israel leads the people of Israel out of Israel by killing the firstborn of every child in Egypt. Goes up to the top of Mount Sinai, is giving the 10 Commandments to Moses. While he's there, his people disobey and start worshiping another God. And the God of Israel tells Moses to leave him, "Depart from me," he says, "because my people are worshiping another God and I'm going to destroy them." And what's troubling is the way Moses pleads for the people's life. He doesn't plead to the character of God as creator. He doesn't say, "You made these people in your image. You love them. You should spare them." He instead appeals to the divine's ego and says, "If you destroy them, you're going to look really bad." And it works. The God of Israel repents and does not bring on the destruction of Israel as God had intended. Later, they get to Canaan. And now the God of Israel, who's been doing all the killing himself, both at the flood as well as when God of Abraham and then throughout, now that God says to the people, "Now it's your turn. I want you to go through and kill everybody. Every man, every woman, every child, leave nothing alive that breathes, every animal." And the people do it. Later, in the Psalms, the psalmist cries out to God to destroy his enemies. And the psalmist praises God for destroying his enemies. Read Psalm 136. So in the Psalms, we see the people of Israel defining violence as love. There's only one group of people who see violence as love. It's those who've been abused and trained for abuse, conditioned for abuse. In the book of 1 Samuel, the people say, "We want a king." Samuel goes and laments to God. They reject me as their prophet. They want a king. God corrects Samuel and says, "No, they didn't reject you. They rejected me as their king." So the divine in this narrative is now defining the divine self as king. We start with the character of creator, then we become the character of the God of a man, the God of Abraham, then we become the God of a nation, the God of Israel, and eventually we land at king. And the further the narrative gets from creator and the closer the narrative gets to king, the more violent, the more vindictive, the more nationalistic, and even the more genocidal that God becomes. And now it makes sense why Moses appealed to God's ego on Mount Sinai instead of God's love. Because when you're appealing for a king, a political leader to do something, you appeal to their image. The challenge with this narrative is this narrative, especially coming from the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are considered scripture by 3 religions: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. In the Middle East, we have a war going on with 3 participants: the nation state of Israel, Hamas, and the United States. The nation state of Israel has nationalized Judaism. Hamas has nationalized Islam, and we've nationalized Christianity. And all three of these participants use the justification of this violence. They justify their violence through their scriptures, visiting untold horrors upon their enemies. Americans, well-intentioned Americans, even Christians, go to the Middle East thinking they're going to be the voice of reason. We've never dealt with our own ethnic cleansing, genocidal enslavement history that we justified with our own scriptures. We've never dealt with that as a nation or as a church. We are the last group that's a voice of reason in that area. And all three of these religions are Abrahamic religions, which all use this same narrative. And this is where I see it's really a deep-seated, very troubling issue. And if we want to engage as Christians in this issue correctly, then we have to wrestle with what we accept in our own faith tradition, which is we generally accept this narrative of the character of God starts off as creator and ends up as king. Jesus even plays into that same narrative. Even if you just look bigger picture, right? The book of Genesis begins in a garden, Revelation ends in a golden city. All of these have very colonial ways of thinking. And because we don't wrestle deeply with that, we tend to put our enemies, whoever we see on the wrong side, the same way the psalmist does, which is God's on our side, right? If you read Psalm 136, it's fascinating because it starts with the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever, describing God as creator. And then it goes through all the ways God has destroyed the enemies of Israel, thanking God and defining that as love, and then going back to saying God loves everybody. And we have not wrestled with that. And so we tend to put our enemies, our people who oppose us, in the same, we want the same kind of justice, and we often view justice as being violent. And so, yeah, this problem in the Middle East, it's a gut-wrenching, heart-wrenching problem. And as a native man living in the United States who's wrestling with the history of my country and the church, I am very distraught over the level of confidence many of us have when we go into this situation thinking we're representing a voice of reason, when we really were not.
Thank you, Mark. I think all three of you have raised such critically important points. And in all of your remarks, I was reminded a bit of Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb, a Palestinian theologian, in his recent book, Decolonizing Palestine, talks about Christian Zionism as a settler colonial framework. And he explains it as a theology that is deeply harmful, incredibly widespread, but not deeply held. And this he sees as an opportunity to go in and disrupt, to take the first steps towards unlearning these settler colonial norms, these often white supremacist norms. And so I'm wondering from the three of you, And for our listeners, many of whom I see the names in the chat, many of these are lay leaders who might be thinking, how the heck do I bring this conversation to my church? Or clergy who are like, how do I do this as an adult Bible study? Or even seminarians who are grappling with what it's going to look like to go into congregational ministry in times of crisis. So I'm wondering, I'll start, I think, with you, Dr. Jennings, because you mentioned that people often disagree with you. And so my question is, what is step one for people who say, I hear you and I want to start moving in the right direction, or I want to start doing this work, grappling with these histories? Where do you suggest people start?
Thank you, Destiny. That's a great question. And I appreciate what Ben and Mark has laid out so beautifully. I think the place we want to start is to ask folks who are Christian, what do you understand God to have done to create us as a part of the creation? And what we're trying to, I think the first thing we want to come at is the idea of ownership. And we want to come at the idea of land as a thing. And here, I think it's important to invite people to read the Bible and ask, where do they see private property in the Bible? And what I hope happens is that they realize that they're going to take the idea of private property to the Bible. In fact, to ask them, does God in the Bible, does Jesus in the Bible, do the disciples in the Bible, do they treat land and animals, water and sky as things to be owned? And that's a good place to start, to say that there is a different way of understanding the world. You know, as the great Ojibwe leader once said, the world is full of persons, some of whom are human. And if we begin with the idea that the world is full of persons, and our life in the world is a communion of subjects, a communion of creatures with God, then that's the place to start to help people understand what it means to be, let's use an old word, in fellowship with the rest of creation. And there, if we can start with that story, then we should add another layer, and that is the story of, when do we start to see the world as private, as private property, as being able to be made into sellable, segmented realities? And there we can start to outline, especially for those who wouldn't understand anything about settler colonialism or any of this, we can start to outline a history of taking, of taking land, of turning water and animals into things. And that's really where we have to start with so many Christians, because it's at that fundamental level of understanding who they are in the world as a place where they share a reality with other creatures, is where we have to start to reform a vision of our life in the world. As I like to say, we Christians don't have a doctrine of creation. We have a theory of origins, but we don't have a doctrine of creation. Doctrine of creation really has to do with what it means to live in the world as co-partner, that just as much as we are in the world, we depend on the world. We are, in a sense, listening realities, listening subjects, trying to learn how to listen to our worldly kin. That's where I would want to start with so many Christians, because these are all new thoughts, and so many Christians have never gotten the memo on this. This is not about, again, and I want to repeat something I said earlier, this is not about inviting Christians to think more carefully about their stewardship and their care of creation, because that's where it tends to get turned very quickly. How do we care for? Well, yeah, that's not the issue. The issue is recognizing that you are a part of creation. The great writer John Berger wrote a little book called Seeing Animals. And in that book, he points out that for so much of the world, for so long, people lived with the knowledge not only that they see animals, but that animals see them. And that reality of being seen by animals is there's ethical and moral density to that. That is, your behavior is not just a matter of being seen, especially for I'm talking to Christians, not only a matter of being seen by God, your behavior is also being seen by other animals. And could it be that someday those animals will stand in judgment of you for your behavior? And his point was that it does something to you. I mean, it's very similar to Mark's wonderful example of seeing the sunrise. It does something to you when you live your life knowing that you are also being observed in an ethical manner, in a moral manner by animals. And that your treatment of this world and their place of living is fundamental to your faith. So that's where I would start.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to go to Ben next. And I wonder if you might, I know you've been doing lots of work with the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East and doing a lot of accompaniment work in this kind of space. And so I wonder if you might touch on that work and how it connects to this question.
Yeah, NIMI exists to help, maybe to some degree, far down the road, but to initiate the process of helping walk with people towards something like the crisis of faith that Willie mentioned and that all of Mark's comments were about. It might not start with that crisis with the people that we're engaging with, but to start pointing in a direction and helping people, particularly white American evangelicals, of whom I am one, and who are very much entangled with the conversation that we're having in complicit, deeply embedded kinds of ways. We help to foster conversations with them, to ask, this faith that I hold, how does it, where are the tensions, the distortions between what's presented to us as a good creator in our faith and as a savior in Jesus, a new Adam in Jesus, a new start. Challenge the ways that we hold land, think of land as a thing. As Dr. Jennings is talking about, think of ourselves in relationship to the rest of creation. And not everyone is ready, and not everyone perceives the need for that conversation. But some do. We're finding them, and they're finding us at the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. Typically, their path has been, pertaining to the particular question that we're asking about Gaza right today. They've been watching the headlines. They've been watching a horror unfold, a genocide, and they're actually seeing the images of it. And it's creating deep moral tumult. And then they're turning around and looking to the pulpits in their churches, and they're turning to the people in the pews next to them and wondering who else is seeing what I'm seeing. And some of them are disturbed by the gap between the silence of their churches and what they're watching on TV. And they're poking their head up and looking around and asking, does anyone else in my community see this? And some of them are finding their way to NIMI, and we're finding our way to them. So that has been a story that we've noticed. One of the things that I've been reflecting on in scripture was right where Mark got up to the brother who murdered the brother, Cain, and who received the mark of protection. And instead of accepting that kind of protection from a good creator, he went and built himself a defensive city. And you see in there this impulse to move away from the good creator and the provision that the good creator has offered, and to secure yourself in with your own power. And that's a theme that gets bigger and bigger and creates this moral chaos in increasing ways as the narrative unfolds and moves through Babel, which is a kind of corporate project of doing that same thing. It's to remake this good creation in a way that suits me, but robs from others, makes others less safe. And I think that if we can have some of those conversations that that see the kind of moral turn there from what the creator has made good, and then what we have done with it, those are some places to start as well.
Thanks so much. And Mark, I'll give you the last word on this. Oh, Ben, you're muted again.
Sorry, was there a specific, what's the specific question you're asking?
What is the first step for communities who are like, what do I do about this? Or how do I get engaged in undoing or unlearning this theology?
The first step, I believe, is we really need to go through a crisis of faith. We need to wrestle with what's the land titles that of the homes we're living in and the churches that we're attending. You know, as recently as 2005, the Supreme Court ruled that these land titles are based on the doctrine of discovery, stating that natives are savages, we're not human, and therefore we have no sovereign rights to the lands we occupied. And that gets referenced by the court time and time and time again. The doctrine of discovery is referenced by name by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005. We don't wrestle with the fact that our scriptures call for the genocide of other people. We don't wrestle with the fact that, you know, I didn't go into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but when the men of the city come to get the people who visited Lot out to have their way with them, he says no. But then he offers his daughters and tries to entice them by saying they're virgins. And the next day when they're fleeing the city and they're told not to look back, and Lot's wife turns around and looks back, she is judged immediately and turned to a pillar of salt. So in that story, we have a God who is more concerned about a woman who turns around than a man who pimps out his daughters. That's deeply troubling. And we don't teach that. We don't wrestle with that. We don't wrestle with what do we do. You know, we say, well, the Old Testament's hard, but what about Jesus? Jesus changed everything. Well, none of us would have been allowed to follow Jesus. Right? Women were not allowed to follow Jesus, to be an apostle. Gentiles were not allowed to follow Jesus. He didn't go into the centurion's home. He told the demoniac, no, you can't follow me. Right? None of us, how do we come to Jesus in the first century, would have been allowed to follow him. And we don't wrestle with that. We don't wrestle with these deeply troubling parts of the scriptures that we hold up. And this is literally why I'm writing this book. I'm not writing this book on decolonizing faith to engage with theologians and pastors. They've had ample opportunity to have a crisis of faith. They've worked through it, and if they haven't, maybe they've left their faith, but they kept their profession. I don't know. I'm sure there's some who have. I'm writing this book for the people in the pews. And the goal of this book is for them to read it and to say, this guy isn't wrong. Why don't we talk about these things? Why don't we discuss the way our scriptures are weaponized against minorities, against women, against our enemies today? And what do we do with that? And so, yeah, I really think the church needs to have a good crisis of faith where we don't give pat answers to difficult questions, but we really wrestle with them and say, is this really what I believe? And do I want to continue to follow this? And which is why, as I said when I started earlier, when people ask me, why are you a Christian? The church has done horrible things to Navajo people. Yes, they have. So why do you, if you know that, why are you a Christian, right? If you know what your church has done to Black people, to Native peoples, to women, to other marginalized groups, why do you follow this faith? If you know the history of your church. And that's I'll end with a story. I was listening to a friend of mine, he's Aboriginal, and he was teaching at the Worship Institute's conference, the Worship Symposium in Grand Rapids by the Christian Reformed Church. He spoke about his people's history with Christianity and with missionaries, with the West. Their history is not much different than ours. He spoke very eloquently. At the end of his presentation, he was asked the question, why are you a Christian? We all have our answers to those questions. I usually talk about my grandparents who were boarding school survivors, but went on to work for the missionary and translate the Bible into Navajo. And he said, I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. If we'd been colonized by Muslims, I'd be a Muslim. If we'd been colonized by Hindus, I'd be a Hindu. If we were colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. Christians put the gun to my head, so that's why I'm a Christian. He said, but today, I'm interrogating my faith because I have to know, and free from the auspices of the Western missionary, I have to know, does this faith tradition acknowledge my humanity as an Aboriginal man? I almost cried when I heard him say that. Because I realized my grandparents never had the opportunity to interrogate their faith. And that's the church is able to weaponize its theologies and its scriptures and use them against its own members as well as its enemies, because we have not gone through a crisis of faith and we don't know why we believe what we believe, and we haven't got our own answers to the very, very difficult, troubling, deeply disturbing questions that we all have if we're just honest about it. And I'm convinced before we can run off and make peace in the Middle East, we have to have that crisis of faith. Otherwise, the peace we bring there will only be temporary and will not be long-lasting. Thank you for letting me share that.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. And for our last word, I see Terry Wildman in the chat asks, is there any hope for the Bible? But I'll expand this with our subtitle and saying, Undoing Possession Through Christian Hope is the subtitle of this webinar. So for your final remarks, and I'll give you just about 3 minutes each with our time left to reflect just a little bit. Is there hope? If so, what might hope look like in this time of crisis for each of us, for the Middle East, and for so much of our bleeding world? Ben, I am going to start with you.
I find rich ground for hope in the first few chapters of the Old Testament and the first few chapters of the New Testament. in the goodness, the harmony, the love that is encoded into creation, and the goodness and the love that is exemplified in the life of Jesus. I think in some way, those chapters, those stories might be the most disregarded, the least taken seriously in Scripture. The beginning of creation and the life of Jesus. And if only we were to listen to the words of Jesus, the kind of radical lives of love and of relinquishing our Cain-like impulse at self-securing in this world. If we can learn that, that's a place where hope can grow.
Thanks so much, Ben. Mark, I'll come to you next if you have anything to add on this question.
The hope I want to offer is the hope that I received to ask the questions that I'm asking, which came from watching the sunrise. If you read the introduction on Southern Truths, it talks about some reflections on watching the sunrise and why that's important. But after my campaign, I was deeply wrestling with God. And I would go and watch the sunrise, and I would praise God for the beauty of the sunrise and for a new day and another chance to walk in beauty. And then I would walk up the river and I would pray. And within 5 minutes, I'd be screaming at God. God, I have a book of you showing mercy after mercy after mercy to the people of Israel. I have 1,600 years of church history with you allowing Western European Christians to act with impunity. I have very few stories, if any, of you on a global level doing anything for black and brown people who aren't Jewish. Where are you? To figure that out, I realized at the sunrise, I was communing with Creator. And walking up the river, I was screaming at the God of Abraham. Now, I'm sure the Jewish people and most Western Christians will see Creator and the God of Abraham as a single entity. But I can't. I know Creator, not just from the Bible, but from watching the sunrise and from my own people's stories. The God of Abraham, the God of Israel, would have killed me had I met the Israelites, had I been living in Canaan, right? Steve Newcomb wrote a great book called Pagans in the Promised Land. I would have been a pagan in the Promised Land. Most of us, all of us would have been pagans in the Promised Land. And so I can't follow that along. But what I realized was by watching the sunrise day after day, after 25 years, I realized no matter what I did in the past 24 hours, no matter what my community did in the last 24 hours, no matter what my nation did in the last 24 hours, no matter what Catholic priest did in the last 24 hours, no matter what my president did in the last 24 hours, no matter what the globe did in the last 24 hours, every single morning the sun rose. Every single morning. And I had another opportunity, another day of mercy to know Creator and to walk more in beauty with the people I'm around. And so when I read later in the book of Genesis that God saw creation and saw what was going on at Noah's Ark and said, I'm going to kill everybody, I was able to read that and say, that's not Creator. When I read what happened up at Mount Sinai, kill everybody, that's not Creator. And it allowed me, didn't give me the answers, but it gave me the courage I've never had before to ask the questions that I'm asking, because I feel so unbelievably secure in my relationship with Creator. And that's the hope I want to offer people. Wake up, watch the sunrise, allow that to begin to shape and frame your understanding of who Creator is, and then begin to interrogate your faith and walk through the crisis of faith that I talked about.
Thank you so much, Mark. And Dr. Jennings, to you for the final word.
Well, thank you so much, Justine, and I'm glad to have had this opportunity to be with Ben and Mark. This has been wonderful. You know, I always say that it's best to understand hope not as a feeling or a sentiment or an intuition or a hope or optimism. Hope is a discipline. And so what it means to live in hope is to be disciplined by following God. And in this regard, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think part of what that means is that we enter into the beautiful kind of struggle that Mark has articulated so wonderfully in his comments, that there is a struggle to understand who this God is as we try to understand who we are. You know, there's always two mysteries that shape the Christian life. There is the mystery of who God is, and then there's also the mystery of who we are. And neither one of those things we grasp fully. But I do think for your listeners, what I want to say is that there is great hope if we do this following. And as we do this following, what's in front of us is what we know is involved with following this God. And that is moving toward justice and mercy. That's what's always at heart necessary in following God. And so I live by hope. And for me, hope is not based on how well things are going at the level of the nation or the economy, or even at the level of the life of the church, but it's based in the life of God.
Thank you so much. I feel like we just scraped the iceberg. This conversation could go on for hours and hours. And I think we have many book club ideas based on all of the incredible works that the three of you have put forth into the world. So thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. For those listening, if you're interested in learning more about Churches for Middle East Peace, you can visit our website, cmep.org. Feel free to reach out to us. We've got a number of great events coming up. We actually have a webinar with our Catholic Advisory Council tomorrow on the state of education in Palestine. That's going to be another great conversation we invite you to join us for. And on the topic of hope, I'm going to close us today with a bit of scripture. This comes from Romans chapter 8, beginning at verse 13, which reads, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage and brought into the freedom and glory of God." And so as we reflect on hope and land, stewardship, discipleship, and the sunrises, I hope that this conversation has been generative and useful to you, and that it can be the first step in broader conversations about the role each of us as Christian witnesses has to play in calling for justice in the Middle East and for the world at large. So thank you for joining us. Thanks again to our panelists, and we wish you all a great rest of your week ahead. Thank you all.